Proszę Państwa, korzyści z migracji to przede wszystkim korzyści dla tych osób, które migrują. Nie możemy mówić o o korzyściach z migracji z pominięciem tychże osób. Stąd wydaje mi się, że tegoroczny raport jest wyjątkowo cenny i wyjątkowo interesujący. Bardzo dziękuję jego autorom za podjęcie tego tematu i wierzę, że będzie on naprawdę inspiracją dla nas wszystkich do dalszej pracy. Oddaję już głos panu Gervais Appave. Gervais, we are very happy you came to Poland. We're very grateful, and we are all impassioned to hear how happy migrants really are.
I don't know how often an event has to be repeated before it becomes a tradition. But this is the third time we are presenting our World Migration Report in Warsaw. So if it is not yet a tradition, at least we can say that IOM has developed already a very good habit. It is IOM's flagship publication that comes out roughly every 2 years. And the theme, as Anna pointed out, is migrant well-being and development. 7th report in the series with a particular focus on the migrant. First of all, I'm going to situate the World Migration Report within the present global policy context. I'll lead you very quickly through some of the distinctive features of the report, what makes it different from other migration studies and from reports we have produced in the past. Most importantly, I will lead you to key findings in the report, focusing on 2 aspects. First of all, our findings on what we call the 4 pathways of migration, that is the nature of contemporary global mobility, and at the center of the report, evidence about migrant well-being. As you know, this year is a special year for the international community that focuses on mobility, on migration. Just over a week, there will be a very important conference in New York, which is the high-level dialogue on international migration and development. And we wanted this report to be a contribution to this particular high-level dialogue in New York. But there are a number of other events that are particularly relevant to migration and development, one of which is the ICPD process plus 20. The International Conference on Population and Development was held in 1994 in Cairo, and it had a lot to say about migration and development. And now, 20 years down the track, the international community will assess what progress, if any, has been made since those first discussions in 1994. And perhaps most importantly, as many of you would know, the attention of the international community interested in development is focused on the formulation of a new set of goals having to do with development that will either complement or replace the Millennium Development Goals. Now, you will recall that the original Millennium Development Goals never mentioned migration. Read through them and you will see that migration is absent. Now, this time around, there is a very important need for migration to be at least acknowledged, to be integrated within the new goals. But the question is how to do it, how to go about it. Now, the other contextual issue that affected our thinking in the preparation of the report is growing interest in the notion of human well-being. As Anna said again, in the past, development has very often been measured purely in macroeconomic terms, GDP, employment, and so on. So it's been a rather abstract economic outlook on development. But governments across the world are now saying that we must find more meaningful ways of measuring development. It is no longer satisfactory just to say a country is experiencing economic growth. Governments want to know whether you, their citizens, are actually experiencing higher levels of well-being. And we wanted that reflected in the report. There are perceptions all over the world that well-being is a better way of measuring societal progress. Therefore, it's less about poverty reduction in poor countries, or not just about poverty reduction, but human development worldwide, as it affects all human beings. Let me quote to you two important statements which I've taken from 100 others that reflect this particular thinking. President Sarkozy of France, just a few years ago, asked a commission led by Nobel Prize winners Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen, Jean-Paul Fitoussi, to look at that notion of human well-being. And they said, what we measure affects what we do. The time is ripe for our measurement system to shift emphasis from measuring economic production, I'll add exclusively, to measuring people's well-being. So that affected our thinking very much. And the United Nations General Assembly echoed this statement by saying we need to put the notion of well-being and sustainability at the core of our reflections about the future shape of the global development framework beyond 2015. So with this background in mind, we produced a very different report. Its distinctive features being, yes, first, it's the first ever global report on migration that focuses on well-being, human well-being. It draws on a unique source of data covering 25,000 migrants in more than 150 countries. And incidentally, we compared the levels of well-being of these migrants to a core group of native-born respondents that was even larger, 440,000 native-born respondents, compared to 25,000 migrant respondents in more than 150 countries. And we hope that to have a more thorough discussion of those levels of well-being by looking at them along 4 different pathways. I'll come back to that notion of pathways. So in so doing, it was our hope that we would put migrants at the center, replace rather migrants at the center of the equation. And in so doing, we were in fact following one of the recommendations of our previous World Migration Report, which came out in 2011, and which was about perceptions of migrants. And in the preparation of that report, we came to realize all of a sudden that when we discussed migrants or migration, we very often talk about migrants. Very often, with the best of intentions, we talk on behalf of migrants, but actually we never have the time to give migrants a chance to speak about themselves and their experiences, and that we wanted to change. Development about well-being, putting migrants at the center. Migration is not just a south-north phenomenon. Migration improves human development, and we're looking at some of the ways forward. I'll come back to that at the end of my presentation. Now let me begin with a look at the actual findings in the report, dividing them into 2 sets. First of all, some findings, some interesting findings about patterns of mobility. This report is very dense and it's packed with information. So in 30 minutes, I will not be able to do justice to the report. And I really recommend you to go into the report and to use it as a reference, because it will introduce you to a number of different features of migration which had never been brought out before. Why 4 pathways of migration? Well, simply because we tend to look at the world and divide it between developed and developing countries. And we wanted to know, in fact, whether movement between these two worlds would make a difference. We started with a null hypothesis. In other words, we started by saying, well, we'll ask migrants all over the world about their levels of well-being. And maybe, just maybe, they'll tell us that they all feel the same about the experience of migration. But then we thought, well, maybe not. Let's look at it and see whether there are differences. Of course, we came up with a problem of defining the North and the South. As you may well know, you cannot just look at countries and say, you're in the North and you're in the South, because the North and the South are not geographically defined. But if they're not geographically defined, how do we define them? And we looked at a number of possibilities before finally using the distinctions that are drawn by the World Bank, which is a bank that focuses on development. We could have chosen others. There were 2 or 3 possibilities, but we thought that that one made the most sense when looking at migration. Please bear in mind, of course, that these are just constructs. North, South, they are analytical constructs, and therefore they help us in our analysis, but there may be different ways of doing it. Please note also that within each of these worlds, or pathways to movement, North-North, South-North, North-South, and South-South, there are many differences. But we decided to look at the broad pathways in order to understand and to analyze human well-being. Now, a few findings very quickly. Please put up your hands if I lose you, because I'm going to race through these very quickly, just to give you glimpses and insights into the report. First, most international migrants move from the south to the north or between countries in the south. So there are 2 important axes that dominate. South-north, in other words, from developing to develop, and from developing to developing. These are the large axes. And the graphic there is the one you must keep in mind if you want to understand the paths of mobility. 40% of all migrants move from the south to the north. 33% move between developing countries in the south. 22%, and I want to emphasize that because it's very often ignored, move between developed countries. And heavy emphasis again on the form of movement which is almost totally ignored in research, which is the movement from developed countries to developing countries. I will come back to that in a minute and explain to you why it is important, even to countries such as Poland. The number of migrants, of south-north migrants, increased the most during the last decade. So that is where the greatest increase is in terms of movement between the south and the north. However, they represent less than half of all movements. So I guess what we are saying, while most of the attention of researchers is focused on movements between developed countries and developed countries, we mustn't forget that this represents only less than half of all global mobility. Most international migrants originate in the south. That's in sheer numerical terms. Most migrants come from South countries. But we were fascinated by the fact that people in the north are more likely to migrate. Again, a fact which has been largely ignored by research. In other words, you're more likely to move if you are in a wealthy country than if you are in a poor or developing country. Now, that goes counter to a lot of the thinking which has said that lack of development is responsible for migration. In fact, what we find is that the more a country is developed, the more likely people are to move. I don't know what the implications are there. We'll have to think about that. A small majority of international migrants are male. It's more or less a balanced proportion. It's almost 50-50, with a small dominance of male migration, except in the case of north-north migration between developing countries, there are more women than men who move. Again, we don't know the reasons for that. That invites further research. Migrants in the south are more likely than those in the north to be at low and high extremes of the age distribution. In other words, migrants from the south tend to be very young or old, whereas between developed countries, migrants are in the working age, are focused in the working age brackets. Distribution of work skills is also very interesting. All working skill levels are represented among migrants, but there tends to be a concentration in either the lowest skilled or the highest skilled brackets globally. More than half of the 20 migration corridors are accounted for in the south. In other words, this is where the largest flows of migration occur, and the arrows there show you some of the most important migration corridors. Most global remittances grow from north to south. We knew that, from developed countries to developing countries. But we also found that there are significant south-south flows and north-north flows. And this table reflects some of these flows. Now, a very interesting finding in the report is that in recent years, there is a clear emerging trend in movements from developed countries to developing countries. Now, that caught us by surprise when we saw how strongly this line of movement was emerging. Here I'm talking, for instance, about migrants who have left countries such as Portugal or Spain and have gone south to countries such as Mozambique or Angola or even Brazil. What can explain this particular flow of migrants? One, the economic recession has hit young people hard. And when they realize that there are no work opportunities for them, in Europe, for instance, they start looking elsewhere. So we feel that that is one of the important drivers. More and more multinational companies are establishing a global presence. And again, young people are moving out in order to staff those branches which are found elsewhere in the world. There is a lot of return migration. Migrants who came to Europe, to the US, to Canada, to Australia, and now feel that there are better opportunities in their countries of origin and who are going back home. There is a lot of student migration. And finally, but very distinctly, there are strongly emerging flows of retirees. Poland might be a little bit cold, and there are opportunities elsewhere in the world to spend a happy, peaceful retirement, but it's a distinct trend. So there is an issue there. We will check our data, look at its reliability, and very much follow that trend. Now let me very quickly take you to what I consider to be the most important part of the report. I will underline the fact that we at IOM would never have been able to do this research without the help of Gallup. They have an extremely powerful database, and on top of that, they have extremely powerful analytical instruments. And it is with their help that we were able to get representative samples of migrants in more than 100 countries and compare these findings and test them. Because we set out to look at levels of well-being, we had to establish some baselines. How do you know whether there are gains or losses? You need to establish, first of all, a point of comparison. And with the help of Gallup, let me acknowledge their contribution and give them credit. Gallup developed a specific methodology which enabled us to compare migrants with two groups of reference. First, we compared the migrant contingent in a particular country with native-born respondents. So we wanted to know whether the levels of well-being of migrants were equal to the levels of native-born people, or lower or higher. But that didn't satisfy us, because we wanted to know also whether the actual movement had improved their levels of well-being. So we compared the migrants with a matched group of respondents in the country of origin. So I underline double comparison, asking migrants whether their levels of well-being were, when compared to native respondents, and also asking them, and also finding out whether their levels of well-being were higher than matched, than similar groups of people left behind in their countries of origin. Now, let me just halt there for a minute and ask what we meant by well-being. If I were to ask you this morning, what is your level of well-being? How would you reply? What do you understand by well-being? It's not just happiness, I hasten to add. It is much more than that. And so, again, with the help of the Gallup people, we came up with a very comprehensive definition of well-being, which consists in the middle, yes, subjective well-being, that general something which enables us to say today that we're feeling well, or maybe we're feeling not so well, I don't know. But that feeling is informed by very objective realities. What are these? Financial, physical, career well-being, community well-being, and social well-being. So it's a combination of all these things. Subjective well-being is just, there were a number of questions that were simple evaluative questions, and in fact there were two of them that were really important. I could ask them of you today if you want to test your well-being. And the first one is what we call evaluative well-being, that asks you to have a quick look at your life over in recent months and years, and how you rate it. And whether you say you're a sort of, well people or not. And the other one is more interesting. It's asking you simply whether over the last 24 hours you are happy or sad. Okay? And that put together gives us a first general measure of well-being. But then there's financial well-being, which is asking you, how's your level of income? Does your level of income enable you to have the resources you need for accommodation, your physical needs, and so on? Career well-being is how you view yourself as a professional, as a worker, whether you're satisfied with that or not. Physical well-being is about your health, whether you consider yourself to be in good health or not, whether you have access to good medical services or not. And social well-being is about your networking. Do you consider yourself right now as being isolated in this world with Kafkaesque angst, I'm all alone? Or do you feel that you are part of a rich network, family network, work network, social network? Do you tweet around to 100 friends around the world? Are you on Facebook? Do you talk to lots of people or not? That's social well-being. And finally, there was community well-being. Now, you may ask me, what's the difference between social well-being and community well-being? Community well-being is about your feeling of security in the community in which you live. Do you feel able to walk around Warsaw quite easily? Or do you constantly look behind you and say, I'm afraid? You know, how comfortable, at ease are you in the community in which you live? So, the measures were then used to do the comparisons. Now, here are the comparisons, and you'll see that some of them are surprising. Migrants in the north make the largest gains overall. Overall life evaluation increases, they say they're better off financially, and they're more satisfied with personal health, care, and their health. This is something we did not expect. Migrants in the south, by contrast, fare similarly or worse than if they had not migrated. Low life evaluation, constant references to struggles to get adequate housing, and worse health care and worse health. Compared now to native-born, as opposed to people left behind, many migrants report poorer levels of well-being. But results differ, there are great variations, between migrants in the north, who say that they have higher unemployment and lower incomes, and the south, who are worried more about their health problems, lack of trust in national institutions, and poorer personal safety. In other words, that's where I'd like to take you back to the report and to encourage you to read it. Because we were just amazed at the differences between the pathways. There's a lot of variation. And to policymakers all around the world, we say, you have to be careful when you make your policies because they have very different outcomes, depending on where people come from. Subjective well-being. Migrants in the north rate their lives better than if they had not migrated. That was a very clear finding. In other words, migrants in developed countries are saying they're doing very, very well indeed. While those in the south rate their lives similarly or less favorably. Very often they said migration has not really made a difference to our lives at all. Overall, migrants all over the world are less likely to experience positive emotions. When we compared them to native-borns especially, that was a global picture. And they're more likely to experience negative emotions. In other words, migrants, the act of moving affects people very significantly. And in terms of their emotions, when compared to others, they do tend to feel a little bit more worried than others. Income disparities with the native-born were more pronounced for South-North migrants than South-South migrants. People who move from a developing country to a developed country feel that they are at a disadvantage. Newcomers struggle the most. That was an interesting finding. We found that overall there was an improvement with time, over 5 years especially, but beginnings are very often hard. Migrants in the north have less trouble obtaining access to basic necessities. There's not so much a struggle for survival. But migrants in the south struggle very often to obtain basic necessities. Globally, migrants have a higher rate of labor force participation. When compared to the native-born, most migrants say that they are in the labor force. Well, that means simply that they're either working or looking for work. So labor force participation high among migrants, but they're also more likely to say that they are underemployed, in other words, that they're not fully able to use their qualifications, and they also report higher levels of unemployment. Maybe a little bit paradoxical, but these were clear findings. Migrants in the north face higher unemployment than the native-born. Migrants and the native-born in the south face similar levels of unemployment. Again, a rather paradoxical finding. To us, it was something we had never actually focused on, that migrants in the north say that overall their lives are better than if they had not migrated, but they face higher levels of unemployment. In the south, the economic situation of migrants may not be terribly good, but they all report that they are, or most of them report that they are employed, although it appears that much of that employment is of a casual nature or an informal nature. Physical well-being, clear distinctions there. Migrants in the north gain in health outcomes. They say that their health is better and they have better access to health services, and the reverse is true in the south. Migrants say that they have more health problems and they have difficulties in accessing quality health care or in having access to health insurance. Community well-being, that was a very interesting finding. Migrants in the south are less likely than the native-born to feel safe, with newcomers feeling particularly vulnerable. Migrants in the north have similar or more confidence in the institutions of their destination country. I'd like to spend just a minute underlying the importance of this fact, which surprised us again. When we talk about migrants in the north, we're often drawn to the fact that they may feel discriminated against, they may come up against xenophobia, and the feeling is that they are therefore worried or they lack confidence in the governments and institution of their host countries. This report shows that this is quite different. We were surprised that migrants in the north, as a rule, showed unbelievably high levels of confidence in the governments of their host countries. In fact, their level of trust was higher than that of the native-born. They said, basically, we trust these governments, we feel that we don't have to face a lot of corruption, we felt that there is a great deal of transparency. And in the south, it was rather the opposite, with people reporting much lower levels of trust in the governments. Social well-being, north-north and south-south migrants are as well networked socially as the native-born. In other words, migrants are very connected people. Whether you're in the north or whether you're in the south, you tend to reach out to others and to be part of a network. This is one of the few findings that was global, everywhere, whether you're in the south or whether you're in the north. However, south-north migrants, if you do the comparison and you do the analysis, south-north migrants have weaker social support structures than the native-born. They say that it's harder for them, in answer to a specific question, which was, if you're in trouble, can you reach out immediately to a friend who can provide assistance and support? In answer to that question, they said, no, we're not always able to reach out and find a person or an organization that can help. Again, something that has interesting policy implications. Let me now sum up very quickly. You've been amazingly patient and attentive. So let me round it off. If we had to put all of these findings together, and as I said, I simply gave you glimpses, can we draw some general conclusions. It is risky, but I'll try it. First general conclusion. Migration does improve well-being across a range of different dimensions. Yes, we can say that with confidence. However, many migrants still struggle to achieve satisfactory levels of well-being. So, yes, overall, but in the detail, there are variations, and we need to take these variations into account. Changes in the levels of well-being of migrants differ between the fourth pathways. There are significant differences. What are they? North-North migrants are extremely well off. That puzzled us a great deal, and I may invite you to try to find answers to that. One possible answer may be that if you're moving between one developed country to another developed country, you only do it when you're promoted. Otherwise, you don't move. So in other words, there is a mechanism there which ensures that when you arrive at your destination, you are better off than when you started in your country of origin. It's a possible explanation. People who move from the south to the north, they gain economically, but often at the cost of emotional well-being. Why should that be? Well, let me try to illustrate it by reference to a hypothetical case. Someone lives in a country in Africa and is a university lecturer. That person migrates to a capital in Europe, North America, and in terms of financial well-being, there is an improvement. That person now earns 5 times, sometimes 10 times more that he or she was earning at home. But that person is now a taxi driver. So emotionally, there's been a loss. In terms of status, there's been a loss. So there's a balance of gains and losses there. People who move from north to south, well, as I explained, end up in, there are very many different groups there. So it's difficult to generalize. What is important is that it is a growing tendency, a growing movement. And policymakers would be well advised to watch what is happening. And the outcomes depend on the type of motivation. Retirees end up very happy. There are others whose outcomes are not as satisfactory. And finally, this report does ask us to focus perhaps much more on south-south migration. Most of the research, most of the policy attention in years past has been on those who move to the north. The report tells us that perhaps the ones who gain the least are the ones who move from south to south. Again, why should that be? We don't know. But let me again put forward one possible explanation. I think what the migrants may be saying is that movement in the south is essentially about survival. So what the migrants are saying is that they have moved in order to survive. In their home country, they were not surviving. In their country of destination, they're surviving, but just barely. So, did they make a reasonable move? Yes. Did that move bring great levels of improvement in their well-being? The answer, they seem to be saying, is not much. And the answer to researchers and policymakers should be, we have a challenge there if we really want to improve the levels of human development through migration. So, rounding up again, I'll go back to the 5 broad messages we try to bring forward. Let us put migrants and migrant well-being at the center of the debate. It is important. Human outcomes are very significant. We need to understand them. We need to know what brings them about. We need to find out more how we can ensure better levels of outcome. Development is about human well-being. It's not just south-north. There are many different forms of movement, and we should watch and study them. Yes, it improves human development, but many don't reach satisfactory levels, so there's still a lot of progress to be made. And one final recommendation we make, with which I will end, is that this study encourages us to think about ways in which we could measure those levels of well-being at regular intervals. And we have begun to think, to dream a bit about a barometer, the instrument which we could use, perhaps not every year, but perhaps every other year or so, where we would measure those levels of well-being, improve our policies, retest the levels of well-being, and see, in fact, whether we are doing better than before. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you so much for coming so numerous to the launch of the World Migration Report.